want to talk. A lot of people were asking what is anarchism, and anarchism, just in a nutshell, before we is just as a very simple definition, the abolition of hierarchy, both in this like of hierarchy or hierarchies that can't defend or can't justify themselves. And most of the times, those hierarchies are the state and capitalism. But those hierarchies can be in any other sphere of society. Patriarchy is a form of hierarchy that anarchists fight. There's other forms of hierarchies that are social, not necessarily political or like economic, but there can also be social hierarchies that anarchists will still fight if they can't, if those hierarchies can't justify themselves. For example, a hierarchy that can be justified. Very often we talk about, we can think about an infant and their parents, right? The infant, like stopping an infant from I don't know, touching an outlet, right? An electrical outlet. You're imposing your will on someone else. You're exercising power over someone else. But in that case, it's justified. But anarchists will say in a more, when it comes to societal structures, having this power over others is not justified and is not it's not necessary, but it's also not not wanted. I'm Goodbye says, I imagine the police are a hierarchy that can't be justified. Yeah, I do think so. The police is an interesting conversation. I'm about to read a book called 1,312 Reasons to Abolish the Police, and and I will definitely talk about it. The critique I have of the police, for example, is a critique of its institutional and its social function, which is to protect the state and its and property. Goodbye says, so would a police system that protects the people be a hierarchy that is justified? No, because if it protects the people, it doesn't need to be a hierarchy. In the sense that, for example, a cop does have power over you, no matter what. And even though we try to put barriers on it, the cop does have power over you. The idea of a way that cops can be non-hierarchical is to like imagine it as the same thing as firefighters, in the sense that firefighters are called on, or they're on call, right? And they only have power once the house is on fire. It's like not a preventive, but it's a reactive force. And firemen do have power in the sense that, if your house is burning, like they can just kick the door and go in your house. They don't need a warrant, right? If your house is on fire, or if there's actually fire and like smoke, if they kick the door in, I don't think they need your permission. Maybe in some countries they do, but I don't think they do. And that's a form of power, but we're okay with it, right? And I think the police can be seen in the same way, but in that sense, I don't necessarily think we'd see it as a police force. Each community would deal with individuals on a case-by-case basis. If someone were so physically dangerous, we can trust the community is able to minimize the situation without an overarching method. Yeah, JTVG, I don't know how to say their name, is right on that. Also, keep in mind that anarchists, and I touched on that earlier, because we believe that, for example, crime, because we were talking about that, we are reducing the incentives for crime. The crime rate would go very, very low, in the sense that because we believe that crime is the consequences of people's social conditions and their places on a hierarchy, especially on the economic one, but could also be another hierarchy I was talking about is racial. If people are on a lower hierarchy, they're more prone to crime. And because if we abolish hierarchies and people have the same opportunities and have the same access to resources to develop and to grow, in that case we minimize a lot of crime. So the need to fight crime is going to be greatly diminished. And like a critique of the cops is the idea that cops maintain a system that encourages crime, because capitalism encourages crime. It doesn't discourage it. It encourages it in the sense that people, especially people who have little to no economic attainment, or the idea that they don't see a lot of social mobility, or they can't foresee it, are going to go to crime to have that social mobility, to grab it by force. And that won't happen in an anarchist society. Yeah, I'm Goodbye says, okay, that sounds interesting. How would justice be carried out? This question isn't to imply that justice is carried out under our current system, lol, just asking questions. As I said, crime would be greatly diminished, I believe. But in terms of justice, I feel like it really depends on the community, because again, no matter what question you ask, I can give you answers. But the thing is, like, I'm no authority, right? And I'm not in the situation where I have to come up with an idea of how justice is to be made, because I don't know the economic context. Because, like, let's say an anarchist society was to be created, it wouldn't be tomorrow. It would be evolved into, and I think it would be evolved into in like maybe decades, maybe centuries, right? So if it's evolved into in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years, those conditions are going to be so different. And I think the best people to develop those ideas are the people who live in it. If it was up to me, and I think a lot of anarchists would agree with that, is that it we have to put aside the retributive justice, or the sense of justice that is retributive. I mean, all anarchists believe in the idea that of reform, reform in the sense of people being reformed, or when people can change. And the whole idea is that once you commit a crime, you are it can be seen as an illness in a way, and like a social illness, because someone who commits a crime, like someone who kills another, is ill. Nobody kills someone without being ill, or at least that's my way of seeing it, and I think most people will agree with that. The whole idea of punishment, I don't feel like is necessarily the good way of going about it. Yeah, that's democracy in a nutshell. And like a lot of anarchists would call it radical democracy, or just democracy in general. The whole idea that the community is in charge of justice, in charge of community protection, because cops also um, enforce. To go back on cops, for example, and how it's not necessarily democratic, is that they enforce the rules that are made by, for example, an elected aristocracy. And by enforcing these rules and like basically forcing people to conform to laws and to policies put in place by people that don't even live in your community, well, that's anarchists would call it like not unfair, but like unjustified. Oh, the Proctophile. First time seeing you in chat. Welcome, welcome, welcome. May I ask what makes you feel that capitalism encourages crime? Crime seems legal, a universal constant, irrelevant of the political system of the area it occurs in. I think crime can be constant, yeah, for sure. There can be reasons for crime. For example, take infidelity. Like the classic story of someone seeing their or learning that their loved one was like cheated on them, and they get so angry that they kill their significant other. Like, though we might associate that to more of a, like, we can say that economic anxiety may add to that to that to that situation, and may add to that, can be a factor of the overreaction of the man. And we can also, because it's mostly men, and we can also talk about how the patriarchy also exacerbates that. But you talked about capitalism, so let's stay on capitalism. That is like maybe an outlier, because many crimes, or at least crimes that we see, like that we imagine today, is always related to the accumulation of money or of wealth. Because most people do crime not because they want to, or not because they just simply want to because they think it's fun, though that I'm sure that happens and it can be a crime of passion. But most crime is related to money and related to wealth. And a lot of crime is either comes from people who don't have that money, or it comes from people who just want more money. And more money is always encouraged in a capitalist system because more money means more power. When you correlate money with power and you enable power and privilege through the accumulation of wealth, then people are going to go for wealth by any means necessary. The whole idea is that if wealth is not tied to power, and if there's no way to accumulate wealth to get an advantage over other people, or to get privileges, or to get an edge on commodities, or on your access to commodities over others, then there is you greatly reduce the incentives to create crime. I'm Goodbye says, but how do you ascribe to an ideology that isn't fully visualized? And that's super interesting. It's a really, really good question, and I'll repeat it for those who didn't hear it in the back. But how do you? Okay, let me do it again. Sorry. But how do you ascribe to an ideology that isn't fully visualized? And personally, I ascribe to that ideology, and it's not even an ideology in the sense that it's not even fully visualized. It's not. There's no like. Yeah, exactly like you said. It's not visualized. Like that political philosophy, we can say, I ascribe to it mainly because it isn't visualized. I am extremely skeptic of ideologies that are visualized because ideologies or like systems can't be visualized. I don't think they can. And I talked about it in the previous stream, but capitalism wasn't visualized. It can't be. It's such like these kind of systems, these social economic systems can't be visualized because they're so nuanced and complex. They're adapted into, and they're fixed as they go along, and they're adapted, they're flexible, they're malleable. And when something is fully visualized, you have to be extremely skeptic about it, because not only very often when a doctrine comes fully visualized, it comes with the people who visualized it, or the people who enforce its visualization, right? So, all right, our new ideology, the new way of doing it is this, that, this, and this. This is the way, and this. So I can open my hand. These are how we do our ideology. But what if people disagree with that, right? Then they become traitors of the revolution, blah, 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 and then it goes really wrong. And then they send the tanks. They send the tanks. That's what they do. Right? And it's like, you have to be skeptical of a fully visualized ideology, especially when the context is going to be super different in the future. Whenever that ideology needs to be put in place, context is going to be extremely different. But also, the context within the context is going to be different, in the sense that, that ideology is going to have to be, and like, even like, for example, I'm not saying that Marxists don't know this, but like, if my ideology was like, I had a fully visualized ideology, well, is it going to be able to be applied in 100 years? And in 100 years, will it be able to be applied in Colombia? Will it be able to be applied in Montreal? Will it be able to be applied in Paris, in the Philippines? Blah, blah, blah. Like, it can't. So you have to be skeptical of that. And I think anarchism is rightfully skeptical of fully visualized ideologies. And I like it for that. I love it for that. And when you give power to the people, you give power to the people not to adopt a charter, but you give power to the people to write that charter, or write the way they want to live. Not to say, all right, I want this way to live, but to tell them, all right, you decide how you want to live, right? Yeah, Fanfax answered that more succinctly a while ago, saying we're not equipped with detailed scenarios that will comprise an anarchist society. Yeah, and rehabilitation is what I was looking for earlier. Thank you. Voice in his head, also new, I think. I've never seen you. Welcome. And they say property crime may go down. Yes, yeah. But what about murder, assault crimes, sexual assault based more on individual emotion and agency rather than economic circumstances? Will these crimes diminish too? Um, like I said earlier, very often these crimes are also based not like on individual emotion, but I don't think they're fully individual. Um, and there's still economic anxieties that can add to those crimes and to the way people, to the way people respond to certain situations that might lead them to crime. And also, as I said earlier, like there's also other hierarchies to be dismantled. For example, racism and patriarchy, which which make, for example, femicide more which enable femicide in a way. That's just part of the answer. Um, I think those crimes would diminish, but they would not like become zero, right? But I do think that in a more free society where people feel more, at least I'm hoping, feel more, don't have to go to do a 9 to 5 for 40 hours a week, doing a shit job they don't like, going back home for a weekend, doing nothing they like. Like I don't know. I feel like a lot of people live miserable lives. That's the 9 to 5 is if they have only one job and not two or three. Most people live paycheck to paycheck. That creates economic anxiety. A lot of people are just not happy with their lives, feeling very lonely. The community feeling, the bond with communities are taken away from people. There's a very strong individualism that is exacerbated by capitalism. Like the crimes would diminish. Like I'm not saying they're going to become zero. Like you can still have passion-driven crimes for sure. But we have to understand as well that like property crime may go down, but there's also anxieties that people have when they do crime that are also linked to our economic system, I believe. Yeah, Garish Grackle said it's systemic, socially, economically, etc. Yeah, poverty is beneficial to capitalism, says Rishab. Yeah, it is. It's essential to capitalism. If you don't have any poverty, like if you threaten people to do shit jobs with the threat of losing your house or not being able to feed yourself, you need poor people. You need poor people to do shit jobs. That's what we do now, because our only way of incentivizing people to do shit jobs or jobs they don't like or that nobody likes is to say, well, if you don't do it, then you're going on the street. You're going to starve. Most people who do like shit jobs, like, is a very broad category. Some people are going to love doing them, but most people are not going to like doing them. Elliot says, and I don't think, Elliot, I've seen you before, so welcome. Or maybe you have, and I'm sorry if you have. Says, is there even a way to separate wealth and power? I keep thinking about it and can't see any. I don't think there's any in a capitalist system, in the sense that if, for example, if there's a shortage of something, wealth will determine who gets access to that something. Medicine, at least in the United States, the rarer it is, the more expensive it is, because now only the people who have the means to get it can have access to it. A lot of people would say that's unfair, but that's what capitalism is. If there's a shortage of, I don't know, milk, how are we going to give the milk to the people who most need it? Or are we going to give it, just put the price up and whoever can afford it can get it? My answer would be, we give it to whoever most needs it. Capitalism's answer is, we give it to whoever has the means to buy it. And in a world, if everybody had the same amount of wealth, then it could be a question of a priority. But in a world where it's so disparate, desperate, no, not desperate, but like in the world where you have people who have incredible amounts of wealth and others don't, then you're making those shortages for example, that's just one example of how it can give you power. But you give those shortages a massive um, advantage to the people who have more wealth. But I think if there was no way to accumulate wealth, I think it would greatly diminish. Like, of course, there wouldn't be any power to be made through, or to be exercised through wealth. Sorry, at the least, we can see wealth as communally owned, not individual. It will go through different reforms as it flattens. Yeah, exactly. Wealth and, all like the products, like for example, just take for example like a grocery store. A grocery store would be like a very like a communal pantry. That's how you can see it, at least in terms of anarcho-communism. And with our capitalist way of thinking, the pantry, like people are going to hoard everything. But the idea is, if the pantry is communally owned, and you can get bananas tomorrow and you can get bananas after tomorrow, there's no reason for you to hoard them. You hoard them because you have this capitalist idea that they have value. But if anybody can get bananas at any time, then you don't have any reasons to like hoard all the bananas for yourself at home and let them rot. So that's a good way of thinking of wealth that is decommodified. That's an element of communism and anarchism. All right. I want to go to Proctophile, because Proctophile is a bit more. I don't know if they're critical, but like they're asking questions as people who don't seem anarchists, and I like that. It says, it seems to me that no political system can function ideally as long as people are involved. They always decay when those with more influence take advantage of those beneath them. The whole idea is that you always have people with more influence, for sure. The whole idea is to not have any privileges coming from that power. So it's limiting that power. And if there is, because there always will be power, and anarchists are very, very sensitive to that. So there's going to be power in terms of influence. There's going to be power in terms of like physical strength. Like that is not going away, even if we say like power is now to the people. The whole idea is that this power in terms of influence or in terms of physical strength can't be manifested systemically, or can't be turned into privilege, or at least systemic privilege. Because like, for example, if you're very influential, you will have privilege in the sense that people will like you more and will talk to you more and will have a better positive engagement with you. But socially and systemically, there is no avenues for which you can use that influence to gain more power. For example, if your grocery becomes a pantry, your grocery store becomes a pantry, you are more influential, but that doesn't mean that you can grab more bread or more bananas from the grocery, because you'll take as much as you need. The Proctophile says, that said, anarchy is inherently too disorganized to solve the problem. That's not true, though. It's a common misconception of what anarchy is. Earlier I was talking about democracy, the political history of a word. This one, which is in French here, but I don't know if it's translated. The whole idea is that throughout time, the word democracy was linked to chaos and disorganization, the same way anarchy is today. Because when you say that there is no person in power or there's no hierarchy, that means that it's disorganized and chaos. But that's not the case, because people vote on things and people discuss and people debate on ways of organizing. It just means that people are more engaged in organization. And I think that, to me, that means for more beneficial organization, more consensual organization. And when people are all committed into that way of organizing, instead of just following orders or just doing as they're told, or just taking their place in a hierarchy, I feel like that makes for more productive members of society. And productive, like, I don't mean productive in the sense that their whole purpose is to be productive, but they'll actually put their own soul and their person, their personhood, their personality into society. And I feel like we intuitively know that when we can give our say in whatever organization we're in, we'll feel so much more not only involved, but we'll feel like we are part of that organization. And because of that, we're going to give more of ourselves to it. I'm Goodbye says, or asks Margot, and Margot answers. I'll give my answer to that question, but it says, but who decides who does those jobs that are reallocated? I don't know what they mean in terms of reallocated. What I'll say is, I'll interpret that song, that question as, what do we do with jobs that are that suck, that nobody wants to do? And the whole idea, and that's one way I think anarchism can be um, really beneficial, is through technological advancement, not for profit, but for the benefit of society. For example, right now, like you can think of any like job that you might think that nobody would want to do, and you can think about that and say, would it be beneficial to automate it? And it might be too expensive to automate it, and therefore, because of that, and because you can't make profit. Like for example, sewage, right? In terms of sewage, like it might be because because it's cheaper to hire people than to automate. I don't know, like I don't know if you can automate it, but that's an example. Because it's cheaper to hire people on low wages than it is to automate that service, then people don't automate it. But if first you decide as a society that automation is something that we want to promote, not for profit, but to free up human beings in doing those jobs that they don't want to do, I feel like um, that will incentivize automation in a way. That's one reason to answer that question. But what about the shitty jobs? Also, it's like the capitalist idea. What about the shitty jobs is give it to people who are desperate enough to take those jobs. Because if they don't, they'll starve, or they'll they'll be on the streets. And I feel like that's just a very unethical way of going about it, right? All right, so I really like nobody wants to do, I don't know, like one of the jobs that there is, and that taken for example is taxi driver, right? Nobody wants to be a taxi driver. So, but we need taxi drivers because the video I made on purposeless jobs and taxi driver. If we don't have, if nobody wants to be a taxi driver, what do we do? Well, people who don't have the means to, like, we'll make sure that some people are on the brink of starvation or on the brink of being thrown out of their house, and say, well, if you like, this is a job that you have. If you don't have that job, well, starve, friend. And then you're targeting the most vulnerable parts of the population to do those jobs that nobody else wants to do, and that's violence. And I don't think that's the best um, way to go about it. An anarchist way of going about it is to say, well, all right, it needs to be done. Maybe we can alternate. Maybe does it actually need to be done? Like some, like flipping burgers is an example of jobs that that people think suck, and some people actually love it. Like I know people who actually like that job, but a lot of people don't. And the answer is, all right, well, if there's nobody to do it, is it that necessary? Is it necessary enough to force people into doing it? In the case of like burger flipping, I don't think so. And that would be another way of freeing up people. On Goodbye says, who decides what's an important job that is necessary for society, though? Elected councilmen? Um, I think people know what is necessary for society. If there is a need, it has to be fulfilled. For example, if sewages overflow, we know that like that job is necessary, and most people will know that their jobs are necessary or not, like when it comes time to decommodify things. Someone who works, like for example, garbage collection, knows that garbage collection is necessary. Someone who I don't know, sells phones, phone plans, they know that their job is not necessarily necessary, right? That's an example. I mean, you'll still have people to sell phones, but like there might not be plans, right? Just all right, here's your phone. JT says, and in an anarchist society, I can imagine some being willing to do the worst jobs and the rest going works for me. And the rest going works for me. I'll even bake you a cake to incentivize. Yeah, that's another thing. Like incentivization can be done differently than we will give you more power, right? Because wealth is definitely power, especially in terms of having the ability to feed yourself. That's like a basic power. Basically what you're saying, like by saying that jobs are related to power is, all right, well, we rely on people not having power at all, people who are desperate enough to have power, because without the power to feed yourself, you die. Then we rely on those people who have no power to get as little power as possible, um, just to survive and doing those jobs that suck, right? There's other ways of incentivizing. And again, that will have to do with incentivizing without giving power, without all those things. But I think, again, it's like the whole idea that, let's say your community, you're sitting down and then the water treatment plant stopped working, right? And it stops working and people are just like, oh, it's not working. Well, I don't want to work. So I guess I'll go on living life without water. Like that doesn't happen. That's not what's going to happen. All right, water's not working. Let's get some people on it, and that can be their jobs. Yeah, and volunteer, as ZH says, volunteer work incentivizes people to do stuff without compensation. Absolutely. There's ways of incentivizing, but there's also the whole idea that because you're doing it voluntarily, the job is much better. And the reason why the job is much better is because there's you're not forced to be there, and there's no it's not do this or die. The whole idea that that you can just stop for, like, you can get away from it, or you can move on to do something else, makes it so that the job is more geared at incentivizing a good workplace. It's less like a work, like imagine your workplace, whatever your job is, but without the pressure to be profitable, without the pressure to generate profits for your boss. How different would that place be? And I'm willing to say that that place is going to be a lot more enjoyable, and that job is going to be a lot less painful. It might not be, but I think most of it, like a lot of people would agree that it would be. Yeah, Thomas says, my worry about anarchism is not so much who works for the water supply, but who decides who gets the water and how much. Um, I guess it depends where you are, right? Um, and I think it can be like according to need, and I think people can be reasonable. Um, in a non-competitive setting, but for example, here, like water is free and is, you take it as you need. Um, so I don't really know, but like in terms of scarcity management, there are different ways that anarchists tackle the problem. Um, but again, in terms of scarcity management, right now it's about who has the money, and if you don't have money, you go in debt or you don't get any water. So like if you're worried about who decides who gets the water and how much, like right now, like who decides who gets the water is the market, and how much of it depends on your wallet. And if you don't have any if you don't have any money, then you either have to borrow and become in the servitude of someone else, or not starve. What's the different? What's the equivalent in English for water? You dry, I guess. Anton says, "Hey yo, first time dropping in the stream. Welcome, Anton. Welcome, welcome. Dry of thirst. Yeah, the proctophile. Yeah, dry of thirst." Anton says, "How do you define your anarchism?" I have a pretty broad definition of anarchism. Um, in the sense, like I'm an anarcho-communist because that's what I'm more privy to. But I'm more into like just the whole idea that abolishing hierarchy, both socially, economically, and politically, because they're the source of evils. I went into it earlier in my segment about talking about anarchism. Um, I think I mostly agree, like if not fully, with Anarchy by Malatesta. That's the French version, but you can get the English version online and maybe soon in paper. But yeah, no, nothing solves everything. Yeah, so anarchism is not going to solve every evil of society, but it's a way. It's like the way that Malatesta goes about it. They talk about it as in terms of a method. Anarchy is a method, not necessarily a solution, but it's a method that people together can come to a solution. Like democracy is not necessarily a method, but it's uh no, Trip Ronan. I wouldn't consider anarcho-capitalism real anarchism, because how I see anarcho-capitalism is like basically a neo feudalism, especially right now. If you and like I believe like one of the best refutations to capitalism or to anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism is to say right now the people who have more power over you is not politicians, but definitely capitalists. And that, if it's deregulated, is going to be even stronger. And I love talking about that because people don't realize just how much power bosses have over them. And yeah, you can choose which bosses you want, but they still decide when you have to leave your house to go work for them. They still decide, when you work for them. Some of them even decide when you're allowed to eat. Some of them decide how you dress. Some of them decide how if you need to smile, what words to use. That is so authoritarian. And if to you that's like you are able to identify the state as authoritarian, but can't identify capitalists as being authoritarian, even though they basically are your personal tyrant for 40 hours a week until your death or until you're 62 or maybe 64. It's still vague. But that's like, you need to be able to see that, right? You need to be able to see the that hierarchy. Oh, I'm happy, Lovis. Lovis says, I've never heard describing anarchism as a method, not a goal. That really speaks to me. Yeah, it's really powerful. Um, I like it as well. Not all anarchists see it that way, but Malatesta is one of the person who thinks, and I could get out the quote if I could find it, but I don't think I will. But yeah, the whole idea that it's a method, because it doesn't have solutions. It's a way to come up with solutions without power as a collective. The Proctophile says there's an ideal time to work, uniforms to identify your position, etc., determined by adapting towards solving a goal that your employer is working for. It's not necessarily unfair. It is unfair in the sense that all that time that you're spending is under the rule of your employer. Like the ideal time to work and uniforms to identify your positions might still exist under anarchism. For sure, ideal time to work will exist in anarchism. But who is it determined by, and who is it and what is it determined for? Here, like as you said yourself, the reason why there's an ideal time to work and uniforms to identify your position and all that is to work for an employer, is to to enrich them. And that's why I see it as unfair, because you're spending your whole life under the authority of an employer, and under the authority of the employer, who will make his decisions according to his own interests. The whole idea is to say you're spending so much time in that workplace and you're contributing so much to the vitality of that workplace that you can have a say in it. Not only can you have a say in it, but the products of your labor can be yours, not your employer's. That the goal that you're working for, you shouldn't be working your whole life for someone else's goal. And you said it yourself, solving a goal that your employer is working for. Is that like your ideal life? Is that human freedom to you? Solving someone else's goal? Or solving a goal that someone else is working for? and doing that your whole entire life until you're 67 if you're from Belgium, is that freedom? That sounds like serfdom. That's no, that's not up to my standards of freedom, and it shouldn't be up to yours. We can do better as a species. It doesn't need to be that way. Anton says, "Do you believe anarchism works on a personal scale? If I would just start practicing anarchism in the current landscape of things, I'd just put myself in a bad position money wise. But oh no, don't do it personal scale. You can do like small community scale, in the sense that if you want to live with friends, like living like roommates are anarchists, right? If you share your food, if you make decisions together cooperatively, if instead of saying, all right, you do the dishes all the time because I pay no most of the rent or whatever, like that's not fair. But like if you can make an agreement on who does the dishes or do the dishes together, that's anarchism, you know. Things like that. Or you can like distribute the chores together. I think that's a way to do anarchism. If but doing it on a personal scale, yeah, you're just gonna ruin yourself. And we don't need more like yeah, we don't need like a way, like I don't think we need to work on a personal scale. But you can, like, if you mean personal scale, like with roommates or with or doing it like more like community work, sure, yeah, for sure. A way to prefigure prefiguration, a way to like create counter institutions or counterpower. If you want to do it more on the local side. Dr. Burner says, "Do you think revolution?" I think revolution.